When the Drachma Wars began in 195 BC, three powers joined forces against the heavy-handed Massalian Republic: the Ptolemaic Empire, the Illyrian Confederation, and the Carthaginian Republic. By 188 BC, the Illyrian Confederation had lost the majority of its territory and had surrendered. The Ptolemaic Empire was in chaos, losing its vast holdings rapidly as their troops were stubbornly thrown to their deaths against superior Massalian armies. Carthage, although damaged by the complete loss of their Iberian colonies and most of its frontier military, still stood with a strong economy, control of much of Africa, and a morale-boosting collection of victories in Italy against Massalia's Roman puppet state. They, like Egypt, were determined to continue the war on principle. But unlike Egypt, they still had the power to strike at Massalia, thanks mostly to their careful conservation of their naval strength. But now they faced a crisis arising from the sheer audacity of a single Massalian general. Tiniest, a man described in contradicting terms by sources on both sides, was clearly enigmatic in his nature. He seemed to love culture and the arts as much as he loved violence and the infliction of terror. A man who lived simultaneously as a scholar and a slaughterer, and a man who by his merits had come to muster an army with permission to march under a special banner. He led the army of Zenon, the army of Eusebius and Artemius, the army that had seen so much of the world conquered before it, the daemons of Polemus. Given the most elite troops the Republic could muster, and a name that made those troops double in worth, he embarked on a mission that would secure his fame in the Tiniest, to deliver them Carthage itself. Cutting a path across the islands of the Mediterranean, with the aid of Massalia's prestigious but so recently destroyed main fleet, the Vengeance of Atlantis, Tiniest quickly found himself sailing at full speed towards the heart of Massalia's last remaining foe. This was a chance to end the years-long war with the action of a single day. But standing in his way was the Carthaginian fleet, guarding all approaches to the city and promising deadly combat for all who came close. But Tiniest, in the few short years he had commanded his men, had gained such a brutal reputation that the Carthaginian sailors were simply unwilling to resist his attack. On a rainy spring day, the Vengeance of Atlantis, led by a bloodied admiral by the name of Arabaios, lunged as fast as they could into the waters around the city, hoping to distract, destroy, or otherwise remove the threat of the Carthaginian fleet, so that the daemons could reach land before they were hunted down. But no Carthaginian ships came. The route to the deserted beaches flanking the city was clear, and so immediately the daemons raced to make landings. The beaches were cut off from the rest of the continent by the sprawling layout of the city itself. That meant the daemons would have no chance to retreat once the landings were made. But it had also made the Carthaginians so sure Massalians would not attack by this dangerous route that they had virtually no defences prepared to stop them. Even the city wall was not complete. Meanwhile, the naval forces that should have been resisting the landing were beaching themselves down the coast to the south of the city, the site the Carthaginians had assumed would be the Massalian landing zone as well. It seems they knew enough of Tiniest to not risk facing him outside of their defences, but not enough to realise that to him, his men were simply tools to serve his own needs, and that concerns for their safety did not inform his battle plan. With the Massalian fleet free to act, their siege ships, each carrying a mighty ballista, began to bombard the few defenders sighted on the walls above the assembling troops. These defenders, like most of the men-at-arms inside the city at that moment, were militia, many with poor equipment and training. Faced with a bombardment by artillery, few had any idea what the proper course of action to take could be. Their indecisiveness cost many their lives, as soon the pounding rocks crashing against their walls rocked the stones beneath their feet, and the wall collapsed into rubble. Scores of men were killed, leaving the survivors to defend not just the ruins of their once mighty walls, but the mangled bodies of their townspeople too. Soon their fears would grow much stronger as the Massalians began their attack. 4 elite companies of Massalian legionaries, troops rivaled by few in the ancient world, formed into their famous testudo formation and began their advance. Under a ceiling of shields, they were quite safe from the arrows being launched from the Carthaginian watchtowers. As they grew closer, the nervous defenders hurled everything they could down upon them, but again the testudo batted the projectiles away, and they continued their advance with the pace unchanged. The two companies who reached the wall first stormed the watchtowers to make sure those that followed would not be subjected to the same rain of arrows they had just passed through. Distracted by this work and surrounded by enemies, some legionaries fell prey to the skirmishers lying in wait behind the breaches. But it was not enough, and soon the towers were taken. The skirmishers were now trapped between the murderous legionaries they had been attacking and the other two companies arriving just behind them. In a deadly melee, the green and panicked Carthaginians stood little chance. As they faced their death in combat, the rest of the daemons, including their deadly lines of royal hoplites, marched without distraction past the fighting and into the empty city streets beyond. Dionysus had expected breaching the city to be easy, but then he had expected his enemy to fight tooth and nail for each yard inside. But instead he was resisted by no one. This was not sheer luck. He had enacted a strategy to exploit the Carthaginian assumption of an attack on the southern walls of the city being the most likely event of the day. The siege ships were bombarding said wall from afar, doing little damage but creating the impression that they were softening the defences for an attack, especially focusing on the towers around the main gatehouse. At the same time, Arrhabaeus and his marines from the rest of the fleet had landed to the south and marched up in formation to stand before the gate, out of range but not out of sight. The Carthaginians felt sure that their original predictions were indeed true, and stationed most of their men either on the southern wall or nearby in the city's central plaza, where they could act as a reserve. Perhaps they believed reports of an attack in the northern districts of the city were simply a ruse, or an attempt at a distraction. But in fact, Massalians had now advanced through enough of the city that the reserves in the centre could see their banners, the banners of the legionaries and hoplites they had assumed were about to storm their southern wall. Seeing that their commanders were misleading them, some units rushed to try and halt the flow of Massalians. Their troops were better equipped and more trained than those who had been slaughtered on the Massalian approach. However, they still compared poorly to the men of the daemons, hand-picked for their rare quality and dedication, and confident in the knowledge that Carthage had nothing to match them at this stage in the war. The best the militia could do was delay the inevitable Massalian advance to the city centre, and even then they were too outnumbered to stop legionaries from finding ways to bypass them and force the surrender of more of the outer wards, or from suddenly appearing behind them to make terror-inducing flank attacks. With surprising ease, Dionysus pushed his men closer to the last reserves of the Carthaginians in the centre, strengthened by the return of many of the defenders from the southern walls as the Massalian plot became clear. So many troops were now mustered there that none could stop the Massalian siege ships from sailing into the city's internal mercantile harbours. There, floating defiantly beneath the walls of Carthage's huge but empty military docks, they were able to bombard the concentrations of men in the centre of the city. The final struggle soon ensued, with the last of Carthage's troops throwing themselves against the Massalian lines to no avail, and many quickly realized that escaping was a higher priority than fighting against the inevitable. Massalian flags were raised in the main agora and outside the Carthaginian Senate chambers. The city had fallen, and the Carthaginian government, aside from those who had fled in time, were now at Dionysus's mercy. To their surprise, the spree of looting and obscenity that was expected did not occur. Dionysus, it seems, was not here to destroy the city, but to make it a trophy for himself and his republic. Most relieved were the common people, who very quickly became acquainted with Massalian law and resumed their activities without notable unrest. The fall of Carthage was not the end of the war, strictly speaking, but it was the end of any serious fighting. Escaping Carthaginian nobles organized the defenses of each and every major settlement they had in Africa, but without fail further attacks by the daemons of Polymus and the vengeance of Atlantis were quickly able to subjugate them. Combined with the arrival of fresh forces in Italy, led by the equally dreaded Cleandros, Carthage's fortunes against Rome turned. Syracuse, their key remaining port, was taken by Cleandros in the autumn, and like Rome, it was made its own puppet state of the Republic. Carthage remained in the war, but would make no further offensives. The same was true of the Ptolemaic Empire, who were seeing their cities fall one by one to the relatively independent Massalian forces of the eastern colonies. For Massalia, it was simply a matter of time before some kind of surrender came and the ultimate objective of the war could be achieved. the complete acceptance of the Massalian drachma as the primary currency in world trade. Over the course of a year, more and more of Carthage disappeared from Africa, and Egypt saw her borders similarly contracted. Finally, the combined forces of Epinetus, Actor, and the conqueror Epaphroditos stormed and captured Alexandria, the capital of the Ptolemaic Empire and one of the great cities of the ancient world. Massalia now controlled the capitals of all of their opponents in the Drachma Wars. Egypt surrendered and agreed to all of Massalia's terms shortly after. And although Carthage still existed in spirit in some parts of Africa, they would be forced to come to terms with Massalia one day if they ever wanted a chance to rebuild. The 8-year World War had come to an end with a complete Massalian victory. It marked a turning point in their rule, with more territory than ever before under their control, and with firm alliances tested and solidified by the conflict, guaranteeing that peace would finally be something the world could depend on. The Pax Massalia, interrupted by the Drachma Wars, was now to resume with enhanced strength. It also marked the end of certain trends and beliefs in Massalian politics. As the war had concluded, the last of the old guard leaders from the executor era, Eurysthenes, had passed away. With him disappeared the last remnants of a spirit born at the founding of Massalia itself, and championed by now deceased Massalian heroes: Xenon, Eusebius, Heraclides, Artemius, Eustochus, Acronius, and even to an extent Cretius. All of these men believed that the cultural union that had saved the young Massalia could have the same prosperous effect on the whole world. After the war, politicians were almost always merchants who had bought their power, or generals valued for military prowess above governing experience. As a result, a more simplistic approach to diplomacy and statecraft was taken: accept our ways or be punished. It seemed the easiest way to control such a large empire with so many different ethnic groups contained within, and it certainly had proved to be effective during the period of war they had just emerged from. Taking a hard line with the rest of the world was going to be very easy as well, thanks to the outcome of the war. The strategic objective pushed by the Timucoi had ultimately been achieved. The Massalian drachma had become the dominant currency throughout the ancient world, accepted everywhere but for the furthest reaches of civilization where currencies were simply not required. This gave the Republic enormous control over the world's grand-scale finances. In particular, the Massalian Council was suddenly launched into a new relevance, for although it controlled little territory outside of the city itself, the fact that drachmas could only legally be minted in their facilities suddenly brought leaders from across the world to the council chamber. Of course, the council was still beholden to the executive legal authority of the Timucoi, who had to be furnished with whatever funds they wished, lest they simply establish their own mints. A key result of it all was the alleviation of the collapsing Massalian budget. The enormously corrupt tax administration was no longer required to keep the city afloat. A suite of trading tariffs, huge supplies of slaves provided in the peace treaties of the defeated powers, and a bounty of resources from newly acquired territories all meant that money was no longer an issue. Benefiting the most from this were the mid-level Massalian magistrates, officials, and military overseers, all of whom were able to continue their own extortion projects without so much pressure from the state above them. Without a war to focus on, the Timucoi resumed a focus on cultural imperialism across the Republic. Laws were passed that made the practice of many distinctively Greek cultural rituals mandatory. Although unpopular on the frontiers, the majority of the Republic's lands and allied holdings were already thoroughly Hellenic, in their ruling classes at the very least. But there was still plenty of work for them to do. The war for a single world currency had been won. The war for a single culture, language, and religion was the only project large enough to grab the Timucoi's attention. It was a project that was to prove challenging, and after hundreds of years of execution, with varying degrees of zeal as the whims of the most popular Timucoi officers changed by generation, Hellenism was no more prevalent than it had been when the Drachma Wars had ended. The best they could achieve was to create a dual culture system for outsiders, particularly Slavic and Germanic peoples, where Hellenism was acknowledged but subservient to more traditional cultures. These people may have been able to explain the role of the citizen soldier, but likely did not know about or care for the importance of such overly rigid ideals. This situation had been created deliberately by the great Eusebius in Iberia in order to balance the preservation of social order with the needs of the wider state. And now it had been accidentally achieved throughout the rest of the world despite the Timucoi's ambitions. Whether it was a better or worse arrangement than the more unified approach the Timucoi had planned is a matter of opinion for the most part. But one point that can be agreed on was that their failure to implement their Hellenization program was a leading contributor to how quickly the Republic lost control outside of its core once the events set in motion by the actions of the semi-autonomous region of Krethia Magna came to pass. Since their very founding, the territory Massalia carved into the modern Middle East were ruled not by the Timucoi, but directly by executors whom the Timucoi theoretically appointed. The first, of course, was Crethius, who laid the extensive groundwork for the conquests his lieutenant Epaphroditos would eventually complete. Towards the end of the Drachma Wars, the territories recently dubbed Krethia annexed authority over the northern domain of the late Artemios, a deal furnished by the power-hungry custodian of those territories, Actor. In exchange for relinquishing control of those fairly unimportant colonies, Actor became one of the 3 executors ruling Krethia, a mandate that gave him power over a region equal in size to the rest of the whole Republic. He joined Epaphroditos and the experienced but naive Epinetus in becoming one part of a triumvirate that acted with powers rivaling those of the older Persian emperors. One such power they were given was the liberty to arrange trade agreements without consent from the distant Timucoi chambers. Krethia sat, of course, on some historic trade routes, meaning that very rapidly they gained a financial turnover and military budget exceeding that of the Western Republic. 100 years after the end of the Drachma Wars, their de facto independence was made official with the creation of the Krethian Timucoi in the great city of Seleucia, a separate ruling body under the direct control of the 3 executors, now able to overrule even decisions on foreign policy that had previously been reserved for the Massalian Timucoi. With their territory not sharing any land borders, and with their merchants increasingly in competition for resources, especially slaves, the Massalian and Krethian Timucois found themselves on occasion in direct opposition. But tensions were unlikely to break into war thanks to a novel system of military rotation created by the Massalian Timucoi as a condition of Krethia's independence. Both powers jointly owned their military resources, which were cycled between each side's bases with regularity enough that men on the ground were rarely committed heavily to one side or the other. To ask them to join a civil war was to ask them to side with one of their own parents. Thus, the rulers at the top could not rely on being able to muster a decisive advantage if they decided to end their debates via mobilization. Instead, money was the method of deciding who had the advantage. For the Massalian Timucoi, the resources of Britain and Central Europe gave them a strong economy that could rival Krethia even without the same volume of trade. Much of Krethia was desert or desolate steppe, so their main approach was to transport goods, not create them. And so, in the 50s and 40s BC, when the deficit of slaves had brought disagreements between the Timucois to a boiling point, Krethian politicians decided it was time to tap into a mysterious but potentially game-changing well of profits. This well was a place they called Qin, and that today we call China. The push east by the conquests of Krethius and Epaphroditos 150 years prior had cleared away many of the large eastern empires that mostly obscured communications between the Mediterranean powers and the Orient. The Western Massalians still knew virtually nothing about Qin, but over the decades the libraries of Krethia had become filled with logs of diplomatic and mercantile expeditions to the region. One thing had quickly become clear. Where the Massalians of the Drachma War era had failed to impose dominance and cultural unity on their whole theatre, the Qin had succeeded. As trade was pensively initiated and the goods produced in the forges of Burdigala found their way to the courts of the Qin emperor, more and more information became available to both sides about what the other was hiding. To the Chinese, the West had previously been a land known mostly through mythology, a land thought to be a dark shadow cast by their own empire. Now they knew that in fact it was a fractured land with 100 cultures sharing the Massalian banner, and a land that had both the skill and resources to produce commodities of remarkable craftsmanship. Interest in the Massalian world exploded among the Chinese nobility, with a kind of cultural safari taking place as they travelled in large parties to observe the cities of Massalian border clients like Bactria and even the eastern reaches of Krethia itself. But the Krethian Timucoi did not return this kind of curiosity. They were not looking to expand their horizons, but to expand their wealth so that they might turn their attention back west to the strangling of their Massalian partners. Capitalizing on the rapid growth of trade with the Qin, they placed huge tariffs on exports that forced the Chinese to pay huge sums for Krethian goods. By the end of the 40s BC, a steady flow of glass, stoneworks, and even artwork was heading east on vast trading caravans, guarded by armoured columns of Krethian guard hoplites, amazing the Chinese with their colourful appearance and glistening walls of patterned shields. Passing the other way were Chinese caravans, laden with silks, pottery and jewels, but also, crucially, books. Books containing the teachings of a man with immeasurable influence on Chinese history and the course of the world, Confucius. These books, reading like legal texts of an irrelevant foreign administration, gained little interest among the Krethian elite, who for the most part preferred their homegrown comedies. But for the people of Krethia, a population forced together by conquest and not granted the same rights that the citizens of Massalia enjoyed after the lasting reforms of Zenon and Eusebius, these books spoke of a way of living that promoted respect, contentedness and intelligence, attitudes that the heavy-handed taxations of Krethia seemed devoid of. And so, one by one, whole towns began an infatuation with Confucianism, an infatuation that quickly brought them to idolize the state that made the teachings of these books a reality, the Qin Empire. While forced to practice Greek cultural ceremonies outwardly, leagues of Confucian monks and followers were forming quickly and spreading from the borders of India towards the Caspian and along trade routes into the heart of Mesopotamia. The unique factor that made the spread of these outside ideologies so sudden was that it was spun and branded by translators and early scholars to become something that could fit alongside existing religious beliefs and practices, while still maintaining an air of superiority over the ruling style of the Krethians. The mix would be called Homerian Confucianism, after one of the most famous contemporary writers on the topic, and by the middle of the 20s BC had become so popular that the Krethian Timucoi could no longer ignore its influence. The most common demands by Confucians were that laws regarding Hellenization be revoked so that they could practice their philosophy freely. But the Timucoi was keenly aware that allowing the culture of a larger foreign power to seep into their lands would be asking for trouble, so they took a reactionary approach. They reasoned that the problem would go away if Confucianism was simply removed from the equation. So serious were they about this that they shut down trade with the Qin entirely, despite how massively profitable it was for them and their power struggle with Massalia. No new Confucian works would arrive, but that was not enough. They needed to eliminate the sources of new Homerian works being created throughout their territory. Almost overnight, the negotiations with Massalia over the division of slaves taken from the latest African campaign and the arrangements for expeditions into the lands north of Britannia were all cast aside. Now the Krethian Timucoi had a new game to play, the systematic oppression and destruction of Confucianism. This stance put a clear divide between those who accepted the rule of the Timucoi and those who hoped to create their own states, Confucian in nature or otherwise. It was a war between the leading Western and Eastern cultural ideologies, and inevitably it would draw the attention of the Qin. Already bitter that trade had been cut off, the Qin were now presented with an unexpected opportunity. In Krethia, there were people who seemed to be as close to being culturally Chinese as the mysterious Western people could be, and who were being persecuted for their nature. Homerian Confucianism had rapidly become so different from what the Qin would have recognized as their own beliefs that really they need not have paid any attention to the matter. But the realization that the struggle provided a classic justification for military intervention did not pass the warlords in the imperial court by. The Qin could restore their trade lines to the Western world and perhaps even subjugate a few peoples along the way, bringing a wealthy bounty in spoils and future tributes. A westward march seemed like a profitable venture, enough to overcome more isolationist tendencies and get the young Emperor Cheng, only just raised to the throne, to agree to the campaign. They had one massive problem though. The distances they would be covering to make the attacks were huge, and if the Krethians resisted it, it would be hard to supply and reinforce the front lines. Had these issues been ignored, the campaign would have begun in 24 BC. But instead, it would begin 24 years later, after the endless efforts of military and civilian outfits to double the capacity of the roads stretching into the Western world, even in places laying down stretches of metal rail upon which single-wheeled supply wagons could be pulled or pushed by horses at huge speed. Finally, when preparations were complete, Emperor Cheng, who had overseen the preparations throughout and placed a large stake in the campaign as his personal legacy, ordered the first armies to march. Cheng would later mandate the day of his formal declaration of war to be the first day of the first year of the new calendar of the wise and benevolent Chinese Empire.
What? 200,000? That's impossible!
Krethians, give no ground! Remember, Daemons, that it was you who took this city, and it will not be you who loses it. Athens will always be Greek.
The Hellenic League won't hold if we don't send help.
Who have we to send?
Prayer to Zeus. He watches his children.
Reports of a new Qin army.
Push these migrants back to the Scordissi. They can have food if they stop the Qin.
There is no food left in Egypt.
With only weapons left for a few companies.
Lords, I've confirmed it.
Britannia has joined the rebels. Kill anyone who capitulates.
They killed the envoys. There can be no peace.
Many sick, many dying, but they will not stop.
I don't care what you have to give. Massalia cannot fall.